Stop working for money and make money work for you. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the tired feeling you carry home after a long day of chasing dollars is not the price of prosperity. It is the sign that you have been serving money instead of commanding it. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is a verse that quietly rewrites everything you were taught about earning. It says, "Remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The power was never in the getting, the power was in the giving." Wealth is not something you wrestle out of the world with your bare hands. It is a power given, a state received, and the moment you believe your paycheck depends on your struggle, instead of on this power, you have already blocked the very channel meant to carry your good to you. Say it with me. I am one with the power that gives me wealth. I am one with the supply that never runs dry. My word is my wand. Again, I am one with the power that gives me wealth. I am one with the supply that never runs dry. My word is my wand. If something in you just went quiet when you spoke those words, you are not alone in this. So many of us were taught to trust our labor and doubt our word. So before we go further, type the 2 words, God supplies, right there in the comments, and let it be your seal on everything we are about to open together. The first key is this. Your word is doing more work than your hands ever could. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that man's word is his wand, that the spoken word held in faith rearranges circumstances the way no amount of overtime ever will. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because most of us were raised to believe the opposite. We were told that money answers to sweat, to hours, to the ache in the shoulders at the end of a long shift. And so we quietly assumed that our tiredness was proof we were finally earning something, when in truth, the tiredness was often only proof that we had forgotten where the real power was kept. Think of the woman who says, "Every morning, I am so tired of struggling for money," and then wonders why the struggle never lifts. She says it while making coffee. She says it while scrolling her bank app. She says it again to a coworker over lunch. 3, 4, 5 times a day, without ever noticing she is speaking, and each time she says it, she is not describing her life, she is building it, brick by brick, word by word, because the word does not report on conditions, the word creates them. She is not lazy, she is not unlucky. She is simply using her wand backwards, casting the very spell she is trying to break. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say to her gently, "You have been standing in front of an open door, calling it a wall. It is not that money is scarce. It is that her word has been declaring scarcity long before her hands ever touched a dollar. And this is true for so many of us. We work the hours, we send the emails, we show up on time, and then we undo half of that labor on the drive home by rehearsing every worry out loud. This is why 2 people can work identical jobs at identical pay and live such different financial lives 10 years later. The difference was never in the effort, it was in the word running quietly underneath the effort the whole time. So this week, notice the words you speak about your paycheck, your bills, your bank balance. Catch yourself mid-sentence if you have to. And when the old line rises, the one that says there is never enough, or this job barely covers anything, stop right there, right in the middle of the sentence, and replace it with a new decree. I have a wonderful new job, or my supply comes from one divine source and is never late. You do not need a new employer first. You need a new word first. The employer follows the word. The raise follows the word. The door follows the word. This is not wishful thinking. This is the same law that quietly built every fortune that was ever built. Spoken low, believed fully, repeated patiently, until the outer conditions had no choice but to rearrange themselves around it. And it is not that you must work harder for your money. It is that your money must finally hear you speak like someone who expects it, like someone who has already claimed it. like someone whose wand has stopped casting doubt and started casting welcome. I decree my word is my wand, and my supply obeys it. The second key is this. Supply has no address but the one you give it in your own mind. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that God's supply is not limited to any channel, that your good may come through your job, or it may come through a door you never once considered, a check in the mail, a gift from a stranger, an idea that becomes an income, a refund you forgot you were owed. But the moment you say, "My only supply is my paycheck," you have nailed shut every other window through which your good might have poured in, and you have made a single narrow pipe carry the weight that was always meant to be carried by an entire reservoir. Picture the man who loses his position and spends the next 6 months in a kind of quiet panic, checking his account daily, watching it shrink, believing with his whole chest that the job was the source. He wakes at 5 in the morning already doing arithmetic in his head. He sits across from his wife at breakfast, unable to taste the coffee because his mind is running numbers. He applies to 20 positions before noon and refreshes his email every few minutes, as though salvation itself lived inside that inbox. And every day the balance is smaller. And every day the fear grows a little louder, and Florence Scovel Shinn would say to him gently, "Stop worshipping the pipe and start trusting the reservoir, because the reservoir never runs dry even when a single pipe closes. The job was never the source. The job was only ever a servant sent by the source to deliver a portion of what was already his. And a servant may be reassigned. A servant may even be dismissed, but the master behind the servant never changes and never runs low. This is such a hard truth to feel in the body, because we are trained from childhood to trace every dollar back to a single visible cause, a paycheck, an employer, a title on a business card, and so the mind quietly builds an entire identity around that one channel, forgetting that the channel was only ever borrowed, only ever temporary, only ever a convenient shape that supply happened to be flowing through at the time. And when that shape changes, the untrained mind panics, as though the water itself has vanished, when in truth, only the pipe has changed. The water is still there, still full, still moving, still looking for the next willing channel to pour through. This week, when you feel the fear rise about where money will come from, practice saying, "My supply is not limited to any person or any job. My supply is God, and God has 1,000 ways to reach me that I have not yet imagined." Say it plainly in the car. Say it while you wash the dishes. Say it the moment you feel your chest tighten over a bill. And watch how the moment you release your grip on the one channel, other channels quietly begin to open. A forgotten refund arrives. A client calls out of nowhere. An old debt gets repaid. A neighbor offers you something you never asked for. This is not coincidence. This is the reservoir finding a new pipe, because you finally stopped blocking all the others with fear. Every time you insisted there was only one way for your good to reach you, you were standing in front of 99 other doors with your back turned. And the moment you turn around and simply say, "I trust the source and not the shape," those doors are free to open on their own timing. It is not that your job is your source. It is that your job was only ever a servant of the true source. And a good servant may be replaced without the household ever going hungry, because the master behind it never changes and never runs low. So let your identity rest not in the shape of your income, but in the steadiness of its true origin. And let every channel, present or still unseen, simply be one more grateful way that origin has chosen to reach you today. I decree my supply is unlimited and cannot be shut off. The third key is this. You are always getting a raise or a cut, according to the self you carry into the room. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that we cannot receive what we do not believe we deserve, that the outer paycheck is only ever an echo of an inner self-concept. And this is one of the hardest teachings to accept at first, because it feels so much easier to blame the manager, the market, the economy, than to look quietly at the picture we carry of ourselves and admit that the picture came first. Think of two employees doing the very same work at the very same desk. One who quietly believes, I am the kind of person who gets overlooked, and one who quietly believes, I am the kind of person who is valued and paid well. And watch how life keeps proving each of them right. Not because the company plays favorites, but because each one is unconsciously directing the very treatment they receive through the self they carry into every meeting, every email, every quiet moment when no one else is even watching. Let me give you a small, ordinary picture of this so it becomes unmistakable. Imagine a woman named Claire who has worked at the same company for 6 years, capable, reliable, always the one asked to fix what others could not fix. And yet year after year, she watches newer employees receive raises and promotions that never seem to find her. She tells herself it is simply bad luck, or an unfair manager, or a company that does not value loyalty. But underneath all of that, quietly, almost too quiet for her to notice, she has carried since childhood a small private belief that says people like me are grateful just to be kept on. And that single sentence, repeated silently for years, has been setting her price tag long before any manager ever walked into the room. Florence Scovel Shinn would say to Claire so gently, it was never the company underpaying you. It was your own concept of yourself doing the negotiating on your behalf, every single day, without your permission. This is why raises seem to chase some people and avoid others, no matter how hard the avoided ones work. It was never about the hours logged. It was about the concept held. Two people can work the exact same overtime, carry the exact same skill, and still walk away with two entirely different outcomes, because one of them is unconsciously asking the world for more, and the other is unconsciously asking the world to simply let her stay. So pause for a moment and pick one real belief you carry about your own worth at work. Is it I am worth exactly what I am paid, and not a cent more? Or is it something kinder, something larger, something closer to the truth of who you actually are beneath the paycheck? And if it is small, begin today to quietly revise it, not by demanding a raise out loud before you are ready, not by announcing a new attitude to your coworkers, but by walking through your days as someone who already carries the dignity of a well-paid person, speaking with that quiet certainty, moving with that unhurried confidence, answering emails the way a valued person answers them, sitting in meetings the way a valued person sits in them, because the outer posture, held long enough, begins to reach down and rewrite the inner belief that produced it in the first place. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the world pays the price we secretly ask of it. And notice she said secretly, because most people are asking a very small, very quiet question of the world every single day without ever hearing themselves ask it. And the world, being wonderfully obedient, simply answers the question exactly as it was framed. It is not your employer who decides your worth. It is your own self-concept that sets the price tag long before the paycheck is ever written. And the moment that tag changes on the inside, quietly, privately, without a single outward announcement, it will not be long before it changes on the outside as well, because the outer world has never once been able to argue with a settled inner conviction for very long. I decree I am worth abundant pay, and I accept it now. The fourth key is this: the state you occupy all day long is quietly compounding, hour by hour, whether you are watching it or not. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that we are continually demonstrating our beliefs, that every state held for any length of time hardens into an experience, and most people never notice the state they are in because they are so busy reacting to the world instead of choosing what they carry into it. This is perhaps the most overlooked of all her teachings, because we love to examine our bank statements line by line, yet we almost never examine our states line by line. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say that the state ledger matters far more than the bank ledger, Because the state ledger is what writes the bank ledger in the first place. So let us walk through an ordinary day the way it actually happens for so many of us, slowly, hour by hour, and see the mechanism at work in the open, not as an accusation, but as a gentle uncovering, because you cannot change what you have never been shown clearly. First, consider the 7 o'clock alarm, the immediate groan, the tired thought, here we go again, another day of the same grind. That single sleepy sentence is already a seed planted before the feet even touch the floor, because whatever is declared in that half-awake hush tends to set the tone the mind reaches for all morning. And notice how automatic it feels, how it seems to arrive before thought itself, almost like a reflex. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that even a reflex can be retrained, the same way a hand learns to reach for a lamp switch in the dark after enough repetition. The mind can just as easily learn to reach for a different first sentence. Second, consider the 8 o'clock commute, sitting in traffic, or standing on a crowded train, and the quiet inner commentary running underneath everything. This is a waste of my life. I am always stuck. And Florence Scovel Shinn would gently interrupt right there and say, you are not stuck in traffic. You are stuck in a state, and the traffic is simply mirroring back to you the very feeling you brought into the car with you. And here is something worth sitting with. Notice how another person on that very same train, in that very same delay, might be quietly grateful for a few unhurried minutes to think. Same tracks, same delay, two entirely different inner weathers. Third, consider the 9 o'clock arrival at work, the inbox already full, the mild dread of another demanding day, and how easily that dread becomes the invisible lens through which every email, every request, every glance from a coworker gets interpreted. One person walks in believing the day is against them and finds proof by 10 o'clock. Another walks in believing supply and goodwill surround them on every side, and somehow finds proof of that instead. Same office, same tasks, two entirely different days being built from two entirely different states. And if you were to follow each of these two people not for one day, but for one full year, watching this same small divergence repeat itself morning after morning, you would begin to see two entirely different careers taking shape, not because one worked harder in the visible sense, but because one kept feeding a lens of lack, and the other kept feeding a lens of favor. Fourth, consider the noon hour, the quick lunch eaten while scrolling through bills or comparing paychecks with a coworker, and the small flare of comparison, of not enough, of falling behind, that flares up and is swallowed down without ever being questioned. And yet that unquestioned little flash of lack is doing quiet construction work in the unseen, laying one more brick in a wall labeled not enough, brick by brick, lunch by lunch, until months later, a wall stands there so tall the person forgets they ever laid a single brick of it themselves, and believes instead that it was simply built for them by circumstance. Fifth, consider the 3 o'clock slump, the tired dip in energy, and the thought that rises almost automatically. I cannot wait for this day to be over, which sounds harmless enough, until you realize it is a wish spoken with feeling, and feeling is what gives any word its power. So an entire afternoon gets quietly declared as something to escape, rather than something to receive. And notice how strange this is when you say it plainly, wishing away 3 good hours of your one life. Hours that could just as easily have been declared rich, simply because the habit of the slump was never questioned. Sixth, consider the 6 o'clock return home, exhausted, replaying the friction of the day, the unfair comment from a manager, the bill that came due, carrying it all through the front door and setting it down at the dinner table like a guest nobody invited. And this carried-over state becomes the seedbed for tomorrow morning's groan, and so the circle closes and repeats itself, day after day, year after year, each day almost indistinguishable from the last, and the person living it begins to believe this is simply what life is, when really it is simply what the state has been. On repeat, the outer days were never really identical. It was the inner weather that kept being copied forward and pasted onto each new morning. Now here is the mercy in all of this. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a state can be changed the instant it is recognized. You do not need 6 months of therapy to shift a state. You need one honest moment of noticing, and the willingness to speak a different word into that same hour. So imagine that same ordinary day again, but this time the 7 o'clock alarm is met with, "I wonder what good is finding me today." Imagine the 8 o'clock commute held with, "I am always right on time for my good." Imagine the 9 o'clock inbox opened with, "Supply comes to me through this work," and also beyond it. Imagine the noon hour met with, "I have more than enough and I am grateful." Imagine the 3 o'clock slump met with, "This day is already blessed whether I feel it yet or not." Imagine the 6 o'clock return home met with, "I release this day in peace and I welcome my evening." Notice how none of the outer facts have changed. The same traffic, the same inbox, the same slump, the same bill, but the state riding through them has changed entirely, and it is the state, not the facts. That becomes tomorrow's raw material. This is why two people can live through the very same circumstances and walk away with two entirely different lives 10 years later. It was never about who worked harder in the literal sense. It was about who occupied a richer state more consistently, hour upon hour, day upon day, until the outer world had no choice but to rearrange itself to match. It is not that your day is doing something to you. It is that you have been quietly doing something to your day, every single hour, without ever being told that this was the real job you were being paid to notice. And it is not that the hours themselves are grey or golden by nature. It is that you have been the one coloring them all along, often without ever picking up the brush on purpose. So this week, try a small private practice, 3 times a day, perhaps when you wake, at midday, and before sleep. Pause and ask yourself plainly, what state am I in right now? Not what happened, not what is wrong, simply what state. And if you do not like the answer, do not fight it. Do not shame yourself for it. Simply speak one true, warm sentence to shift it. I am cared for. My needs are met. Good is finding me even now. And let that sentence stand in for the old one. And if you forget at 7, catch it at 9. And if you miss the whole morning, catch it at noon. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the changing of a single state, held gently and repeated, is enough to eventually change an entire life, 1 hour at a time, 1 word at a time, until one day you look up and realize the grinding day you used to dread has quietly become the very life you once only dared to imagine. I decree my state today is rich, and my day must match it. Subscribe now so this teaching keeps finding you when you need it most. It costs nothing, and it keeps the word coming steadily to your door. The 5th key is this: the old struggling self must be allowed to die, so the true self can finally get paid. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that we are here to put off the old man and put on the new, and this is not a literal death of anyone. It is the quiet dissolving of the false, tired, fearful self who believed money was hard to come by, so that the real self, the one already at peace, already provided for, already whole, can step forward and receive what was always meant for it. So many people cling to their old identity as the struggler, the one who always has it hard, the one whose family never had money, because that identity feels familiar, even safe, even though it is starving them. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say lovingly, let that old self go. It was never the truth of you. It was only ever a costume you forgot to take off. Picture an actor who has played the same poor character in the same play for so many years that he starts to believe he really is poor and forgets there is a whole different man underneath the costume the moment the curtain falls. That is what is happening whenever someone insists, "I am just not good with money," or "I was born to struggle." They are quoting the costume, not the truth. Think now of the woman who was raised in a household where money was always spoken of as a battle, where the phrase, "we simply cannot afford," that was repeated so often, it became a kind of family hymn, and she grows up, gets a good position, earns a fair wage, and still finds herself flinching at the grocery checkout, still finds herself apologizing for her own bills, because the costume she wears is not made of fabric, it is made of repetition, sewn thread by every anxious sentence she ever overheard at that kitchen table. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that no amount of outer income can outrun an inner costume still being worn. The paycheck may grow, yet the flinch remains, until the costume itself is finally set down. So the dying spoken of here is a mercy, not a loss. It is the struggler, laying down a role she was never truly cast to play forever. And the moment she stops rehearsing that old identity, even in small ways, even in the words she mutters under her breath about her own bank account, something in her posture changes. Something in the way she opens an envelope changes. This week practice a small, brave sentence whenever the old identity rises. That was who I was. This is who I am. And let the old struggling self quietly retire. Not violently, not with drama, simply retired, the way an old coat is finally hung up for good because it no longer fits the one wearing it, and once it is hung up, notice how strange it feels to even try it on again. I decree the old struggler retires, and my true self is paid. The sixth key is this: giving and receiving are one single motion, never two separate ones. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the tither prospers because giving keeps the channel of supply open and moving, while withholding out of fear pinches that same channel closed. Think of supply as water in a river. If you dam it up because you are afraid there will not be enough later, the water stops moving altogether and begins to grow stagnant right where you stand. But if you let it flow, out through generosity, through the tithe, through the gift given freely, and without anxious calculation, more water simply keeps arriving from upstream to replace what moved on. This is not a magic trick, and it is not reckless spending. It is simply how a living channel behaves. Closed channels stagnate, open channels stay fresh and full. Consider the woman who has $50 left before her next paycheck and feels the old fear rising. The fear that says, hold on to every cent. And yet something in her remembers this teaching and decides to give 5 of those $50 away, to a friend in need, or to a cause she believes in, not recklessly, but decidedly, as an act of faith rather than an act of lack. And something shifts in her the moment she does it. She is no longer the frightened one clutching her last coins. She is the generous one, trusting a source larger than the $50 in her hand. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this shift in identity, from clutcher to giver, is what actually opens the channel. The $5 given was never really the mechanism. The changed state behind the giving was the mechanism. Now widen this same picture a little, and see the man who owns a small shop and watches his takings shrink for a season, and feels the old panic whisper, close the register early, cut every corner, give nothing away this month. And Florence Scovel Shinn would meet him gently and say, this is precisely the hour not to close the hand but to open it further, because a hand clenched around a shrinking pile only teaches the pile to keep shrinking, while a hand that opens, even in the lean season, declares to the whole of consciousness that this man believes in a source larger than his register. So instead, he sets aside his tithe first, before the bills, before the worry, and pays it as though it were the most important bill of the month, because in truth it is. It is the payment that keeps his own channel from silting shut. It is not that his income was too small for giving. It is that his fear had made the giving feel impossible, and once he gave anyway, the fear itself began to loosen its grip on everything else. This is why so many people who tithe faithfully report that their money seems to stretch further than it has any logical right to stretch. It is not arithmetic. It is consciousness. The same paycheck that used to vanish by the middle of the month suddenly covers everything and leaves a little over, because the state behind the money changed from scarcity to sufficiency, and money, being deeply obedient to state, simply followed along. And notice too that the giving Florence Scovel Shinn taught was never about the size of the gift. A widow's small coin given freely carries more power than a wealthy man's large sum given grudgingly, because it was never the number on the gift that opened the channel, it was the faith riding underneath it. So ask yourself honestly this week, where in your life has fear quietly convinced you to hold your hand shut? Is it the tithe you have been meaning to start? Is it the friend you have been meaning to help? Is it simply the coffee for the stranger behind you that some small voice keeps talking you out of? And notice how each time you obey that fearful voice, you are not protecting your supply at all. You are only teaching your own consciousness that there is not enough to spare, which is the very belief that then goes out and creates more not enough. It is not that giving costs you something. It is that giving proves to your own consciousness that you already have enough to spare. And consciousness, once convinced of enough, cannot help but attract more of the same. So this week, find one small deliberate act of giving, not out of guilt, not out of duty, but out of quiet decision. It might be a tithe from your income. It might be a gift to someone in need. It might simply be paying for the coffee of the stranger behind you in line. And as you give it, silently declare, I release this in faith, knowing my supply is never diminished by giving, only ever increased. Watch what returns to you in the days that follow, not always through the same channel, not always in the same form, but it will return, because the river that flows out is always the same river that flows back in, and the hand that gives freely today is quietly training itself to receive freely tomorrow. For a hand held open in generosity cannot at the same time be a hand held shut against its own good. I decree I give freely, and my supply returns to me multiplied. The seventh key is this, and it is the deepest one, so let us open it slowly, piece by piece, the way a locked door is turned by a key, not thrown open by a shoulder. First, consider that Florence Scovel Shinn taught there exists what she called the great storehouse, the universal supply, holding within it every good gift already prepared, every unclaimed inheritance, every check not yet cashed, waiting quietly not for money to be created out of nothing, but for a man or woman with sufficient faith to reach in and claim what was already theirs. This is why she so often said that man's own word, spoken in faith, is the check that goes to that great storehouse and cashes what is already deposited there in his name. This is a very different picture of prosperity than the one most of us were raised on. We were taught that wealth must be created through labor, inch by inch, sweat by sweat. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that wealth already exists, complete and waiting, and the only real work left to us is the claiming of it through faith and through the spoken word. So hold that picture for a moment. A vast storehouse, already full, already yours by divine right. And your only task each day is to walk up to the window and present your claim with confidence, rather than apology. Not as a beggar hoping to be noticed, but as an heir, simply collecting what already carries their own name upon it. And it is not that the storehouse must be persuaded to give. It is that you must simply learn to walk toward it as though the door were already open, because in truth it always has been. Second, consider what happens the moment you actually present that claim, because it rarely goes smoothly. And Florence Scovel Shinn was honest about this. She taught that the moment you decree a good thing, the moment you say, I am prosperous, I am provided for, the old conditions in the atmosphere around you often seem to rise up in protest, almost as though the claim itself stirs up every old doubt hiding in the corners, waiting to be swept out. So you might decree abundance in the morning, and by afternoon receive an unexpected bill, or a delay, or a discouraging word from someone close to you. And the untrained mind reads this as proof that the decree failed, when in fact Florence Scovel Shinn taught it is usually proof the decree is working, stirring the old debris to the surface so it can finally be cleared. This is sometimes called the dark before the dawn, and every single person who has ever changed their fortune through faith has walked through this exact strip of resistance. The difference between the one who succeeds and the one who gives up is almost never the size of the resistance. It is simply whether they keep their word steady while the resistance passes through. It is not that the testing means the claim was false. It is that the testing means the claim has finally been noticed by everything in you that once believed otherwise. Third, consider the discipline of non-resistance in the face of that very testing, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught plainly that what you resist persists, and what you look at with fear, you feed with attention. So when the unexpected bill arrives on the very afternoon you declared abundance, the temptation is to panic, to renounce the decree, to say, "See, it never works for me." But the wiser response, the response that actually completes the claim, is to look at the bill calmly and say, "This changes nothing. My supply is already established. This is only the old condition passing through on its way out," and to keep repeating the original decree with even more quiet certainty than before. This is not denial of the facts. It is refusal to let a temporary appearance outrank an eternal truth. Picture a farmer who has planted seed in the ground and 3 days later sees no visible change on the surface. If he panics and digs the seed back up to check on it, he destroys the very harvest he was waiting for. Faith is simply the willingness to leave the seed buried, trusting the unseen process, even when the surface shows nothing yet. And picture too the same farmer noticing weeds pushing up around the row before the seedling itself ever breaks through. And how easy it would be for him to mistake the weeds for the whole story, when in truth, the weeds only ever grow fastest in freshly turned soil, the very soil that was just disturbed by planting something new. So the appearance of trouble right after a decree is often simply proof that the ground has been freshly worked, not proof that nothing was planted at all. Fourth, consider a very ordinary example of this whole mechanism at work, because it is easy to speak of storehouses and seeds until real life hands you a real waiting room. So picture a small business owner who has sent an invoice to a client for work already completed weeks ago. The money is owed, it is rightfully hers, and yet the payment does not come. Day after day she checks her account. Day after day it is not there, and every fiber of the old anxious self wants to call twice a day, to send a sharply worded message, to let panic write her emails for her. But instead she remembers this teaching. She sits quietly for a moment and speaks a settled decree. This payment is already mine. It is already moving toward me by the shortest possible path. And then she goes on with her day. She does the next small task in front of her. She does not check the account every hour. She does not rehearse the worst outcome before bed. And when a well-meaning friend asks whether she is worried, she finds herself answering honestly, "No, it is already handled." And even saying it aloud strengthens the very claim she is standing on. And one ordinary afternoon, without any dramatic sign beforehand, the payment simply appears, sometimes even arriving alongside a small unexpected bonus the client adds out of goodwill. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say this is the storehouse working exactly as it was designed to work. The claim was made, the resistance passed through, the seed was left undisturbed, and the harvest arrived precisely on time, not late, not early, simply on time, because it was never actually late to begin with. Only the anxious watching made it feel that way. Fifth, consider how supply actually finds its way to you once the seed has been left undisturbed long enough. Because here is something Florence Scovel Shinn taught that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Your good rarely arrives through the door you were watching. You plant the seed of a new decree. You release your grip on how it must come. And then, often from a direction you never once considered, the answer appears. A friend mentions an opening you never applied for. A stranger pays for something unexpectedly. An old debt owed to you resurfaces out of nowhere. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is the sign of a wish fulfilled through what she called the line of least resistance, the universe finding the easiest, most natural channel to deliver your good, rather than the narrow channel your anxious mind kept insisting on. This is why she taught her students to state the end desired plainly, and then release the details of how, because the how belongs to the same infinite intelligence that built the storehouse in the first place, and it always knows a shorter path than the one your fear was busy planning. It is not your job to build the road. It is only your job to keep walking, as though the road already exists beneath your feet. And so often, the very door you had convinced yourself must be the one that opens, turns out to have been the least likely one all along. While some small, ordinary, unremarkable door swings wide instead, simply because it was the path of least resistance the whole time. Sixth, consider the quiet power of thanksgiving spoken before the visible proof ever arrives, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that giving thanks in advance is one of the surest ways to seal a claim already made. A signed receipt is the proof a transaction is complete, and a heartfelt word of gratitude spoken now, before the check clears, before the payment lands, before the door opens, functions the very same way in consciousness. It tells the storehouse plainly that the matter is already settled. So instead of waiting to feel grateful only after the good arrives, practice saying quietly, "I thank you that this is already done. I thank you that my good is already on its way." And notice how differently the waiting feels when it is soaked in gratitude instead of soaked in anxious watching. Gratitude held during the wait is not naive, it is not pretending, it is simply the most accurate response available to someone who truly understands that the storehouse never fails and never forgets. And there is something almost physical about this. The shoulders drop, the breath slows, the whole body begins to behave like someone who has already received, rather than someone still begging to receive. And the body, believing itself already provided for, stops broadcasting the very lack that used to keep the good at a distance. Seventh, and this is where the key finally turns all the way. Consider that the whole process asks something quite tender of you. It asks you to keep faith, not for one single afternoon, but across the entire distance between the decree and its visible arrival. And that distance can feel long. It can stretch across days that look identical to yesterday, across weeks where nothing outward seems to move. And it is precisely in that stretch of apparent silence that most people quietly let go of the very word they need to hold. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is the true test of demonstration, not the speaking of the word, which is easy and even exciting in the first hour, but the holding of the word steady through the silence that follows. The way a mother trusts a child is growing inside her, even on the days she cannot see any change at all. The way a farmer trusts the buried seed, on the mornings the field looks exactly as bare as the day before. So if you are in that stretch right now, if you spoke a decree days or weeks ago and nothing visible has answered yet, hear this gently. You have not failed. You are simply standing exactly where every single person who ever demonstrated real supply once stood, in the quiet middle, between the word and the harvest. And the storehouse has not forgotten you. It never forgets anyone. It is simply waiting for you to keep your claim standing long enough for it to reach you. And if the waiting grows heavy, remember that the very heaviness is only ever a feeling passing through, not a fact reporting on the state of your claim. Feelings rise and fall like weather across a single afternoon, while the claim itself, once truly spoken in faith, stands as unmoved as the storehouse it was drawn against. So return today, right now if you like, to the plain decree that started all of this, and speak it again, not as a hopeful question this time, but as a settled fact. My good is already provided. It is already on its way to me by the shortest possible path. And let that settle the matter entirely, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that once the matter is truly settled within, the outer world has no choice but to follow. I decree my claim is already granted, and my good is on its way. The eighth key is this, and it brings us back down from the peak into something wonderfully practical. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that within every person there lives an unerring guide, sometimes called intuition, sometimes called the still small voice, and this guide, when trusted, will always show you the exact next right action, the timely word, the wise decision, so that you are no longer laboring blindly through your days, hoping something works out, but being led, quietly and precisely, toward the very opportunities and decisions that make money finally begin to work for you, instead of you working so hard for it. Think of the difference between two people offered the very same business opportunity. One calculates anxiously for weeks, gathering opinions from everyone around him, growing more confused with every new voice added to the pile, until fear alone makes the decision for him by making him too tired to decide at all. The other pauses, grows quiet, asks simply within, "Is this mine to do?" and waits, not for a lightning bolt, but for a settled, calm knowing that either says yes, move forward, or gently says, "Not yet, wait," and then acts cleanly on whichever answer arrives, without needing to justify it to anyone. This second person is not smarter than the first. She has simply learned to trust the guide Florence Scovel Shinn taught was always there, always available, and always faster and wiser than anxious calculation could ever be. It is not that intuition replaces good sense. It is that intuition arrives before good sense even wakes up, and most people never notice it because they are listening for something dramatic, a booming voice, a vision, a sign written across the sky, when in truth, Florence Scovel Shinn taught it usually arrives as something almost embarrassingly quiet, a small nudge, a gentle pull toward one door and a faint reluctance toward another, so quiet that an anxious mind steps right over it on the way to its own noisy conclusions. Let me walk you through an ordinary moment where this plays out. Picture a woman standing in a store, deciding whether to buy a new coat. Her old coat is worn thin, and she has the money set aside for exactly this. But as she reaches for her card, a small feeling rises. Not fear, not guilt, just a quiet pull to wait. And the anxious mind rushes in immediately to argue with it, saying that makes no sense. You have the money. Buy it now. Prices only go up. And she almost listens to that louder voice. But she has practiced pausing long enough to recognize the difference between the loud argument and the quiet knowing. So she waits. And 3 days later she finds the very same coat, better made, at half the price, in a shop she had not even planned to visit. This is such a small story. And that is exactly why it matters, because the guide rarely announces itself through dramatic rescues. It moves through these small, almost forgettable moments, coat by coat, decision by decision, and it is only over months of practice that a person begins to notice how consistently that quiet pull was right. Learning to hear this guide takes a little practice, because for most of us, the anxious mind is loud and the intuitive whisper is soft. So Florence Scovel Shinn suggested a very simple daily habit. Before making any financial decision, however small, pause, take one quiet breath, and ask, "Is this the right move?" And then notice the very first feeling that rises, not the second thought that argues with it, not the third thought that overanalyzes it, but the first quiet feeling, because that first feeling is almost always the guide speaking before the anxious mind has time to interrupt. And if you find this difficult at first, do not be discouraged. This is a listening muscle like any other, and it grows stronger simply through use. The more often you pause and ask before deciding, the more clearly you begin to distinguish the calm, true answer from the anxious performance of an answer. This matters enormously for money specifically, because so much financial harm comes not from a lack of funds but from decisions made in a state of fear or rush, the hurried investment, the panicked sale, the impulsive purchase made to soothe an anxious hour, the loan signed quickly just to make a pressing feeling go away. All of these come from ignoring the quiet guide in favor of the loud fear, and afterward, almost every single time, looking back honestly, a person can usually recall that small, quiet hesitation they overrode in the rush. The guide had spoken, softly, and had simply been outvoted. But the person who has trained themselves to pause and listen first begins to notice something remarkable over time. Their financial decisions start to feel almost effortless. Not because the decisions themselves are simple, but because they are no longer being made alone, out of raw willpower. They are being made in partnership with a wisdom that already sees the whole path. It is not that this person becomes fearless overnight. It is that fear no longer gets the final vote. The quiet knowing does. So this week, before your next financial decision, however ordinary, whether it is a purchase, a negotiation, a choice to say yes or no to an opportunity, practice this pause, ask your quiet question, wait for the first feeling, and act from that feeling rather than from the noise around it, and notice, over the following days, how much lighter your decisions begin to feel, because it is not that you must think harder about money, it is that you must listen more closely to the guide who already knows exactly where your money is meant to go. I decree I am guided rightly in every decision about my money. The ninth key is this, and it is the gentlest one of all. Rest is not the reward you get after the demonstration. Rest is part of the demonstration itself. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that anxious effort actually delays the very good it is chasing, because a strained, gripping state cannot receive freely. The hand must be open to catch anything at all, and so much of what we call working hard for money is really just a very sophisticated form of gripping, of straining, of trying to force a door that was only ever waiting to be gently pushed. Think of the woman who runs her own small shop, who wakes at 5 every morning and does not stop moving until well past midnight, checking the register twice, then a third time, lying awake running numbers in her head long after the lights are off, convinced that if she only pushes a little harder, worries a little longer, the shop will finally be safe. And yet month after month, the anxious calculations change nothing at all. The shop earns almost exactly what it earned before, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a mind gripped by fear cannot direct supply any more than a closed fist can catch falling rain. It is not more hours at the register that she needs. It is one honest evening of setting the ledger down and trusting the same power that opened the shop in the first place to also keep it standing. Now watch what happens the night she finally tries it differently. She closes the register at its ordinary hour. She looks once at the numbers without flinching. She says quietly, "This shop is held by a power greater than my worry." And then, and this is the part she almost cannot believe, she goes upstairs and sleeps, really sleeps, the way she has not slept in months, and she wakes the next morning not to a miracle, but to something quieter and somehow more convincing, a steadiness in her own chest that was not there before, a calm that lets her greet the first customer without the tight smile of someone bracing for disaster. And it is that calm, more than any single sale, that begins to turn the whole shop around, because customers, without ever knowing why, linger longer in a room that feels unhurried, and money, without ever being chased, tends to gather where peace already lives. Consider, too, the simple picture of a child sent to bed by a parent who says everything is taken care of, and how completely, how easily that child sleeps. No arguing with the dark, no rehearsing tomorrow's dangers, simply trust. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught this, is exactly the posture meant for the grown man or woman in matters of money as well. Not a passive laziness that neglects its work, but what she called a working rest, doing plainly and skillfully whatever is truly yours to do each day. And then just as plainly releasing the outcome into hands far more capable than your own, restated once more. It is not the 10 extra emails answered at midnight that secure your income. It is the peace you carry while answering the necessary ones in daylight. It is not the sleepless replaying of tomorrow's bills that protects you. It is the settled word spoken once and trusted completely. It is not the anxious checking of the bank balance again and again that grows it. It is the open, unclenched hand that all supply is finally free to fill. And notice this too. Rest does not mean you stop moving through your day. It means you stop wrestling with your day. You still rise. You still show up. You still do the plain next task in front of you. But you do it the way a gardener waters a seed already planted, without digging it up each hour to check on its progress. Because a gardener who trusts the soil works with an entirely different energy than one who doubts it. And that energy, quiet, unhurried, unclenched, is the very energy money seems to recognize and answer most readily. So tonight, before you close your eyes, try setting one worry down deliberately, the way that shopkeeper set down her ledger, and simply say, "This is held," and let your rest itself become the closing act of faith. I decree I rest in peace, and my supply rests securely with me. Here is the whole picture. All 9 of these were never 9 separate keys at all. They were 9 turns of the very same one, the recognition that consciousness, not labor, is the true source of every dollar that has ever reached you or ever will. It is not your word that is weak. It is your word that has been misused. And once corrected, it becomes your wand. It is not your job that is your supply. It is God working through countless channels that your job merely happens to be one of. It is not your paycheck that decides your worth. It is your self-concept that quietly sets the price the world pays you. It is not your day that is grinding you down. It is the state you carry through it, hour by hour, that either grinds or lifts you. It is not your old struggling self who deserves your loyalty. It is the true self beneath it, who has been waiting patiently to be paid. It is not withholding that protects your supply. It is giving, freely and without fear, that keeps the whole channel alive and moving. It is not your understanding of the how that matters. It is your faith, held steady through the silent middle, that finally brings the harvest home. It is not anxious calculation that leads you rightly. It is the quiet guide within who always knows the shorter path. And it is not effort that finally closes the door on struggle. It is rest, held as faith, that lets money at last become your servant instead of your master. If this word has stirred something awake in you tonight, I want to invite you gently into a deeper place to practice it. The Overflow Covenant is a small circle built for exactly this. For those who want to move beyond watching a single video and into a daily walk with these very principles, inside you will find guided decrees for your finances, short daily practices for training your state the way we walked through together tonight, and a community of others who are learning, the same way you are, to stop working for money and let money finally work for them. It is priced simply at $33, a small gift to yourself, compared to the abundance it is designed to help you claim, and it carries a full 30-day money-back guarantee, because this teaching should only ever be offered in the same spirit of trust it teaches. If it is not for you, you lose nothing. The link is right there in the description below, waiting for you the moment you are ready. So let us return one final time to the words we opened with tonight. I am one with the power that gives me wealth. I am one with the supply that never runs dry. My word is my wand. And from this moment on, you no longer work for money. You simply speak, and money, faithfully, quietly, comes home to work for you.